It's a tremendous pleasure to be here and to renew a relationship with Crown Peak that goes back well over a decade, back when I was actually working for a competitor in the web content management space before I became an analyst at Forrester. So, as you can already tell, I'm an American and therefore not a native speaker of English, so bear with me, and I'm going to go pretty quickly here as well. Literally one word about my company, the Content Advisory. Just note that it is .net, not .com. Almost everything that I've published on customer experience management and or GDPR since the beginning of 2017 is available on that site. A couple of other articles are on LinkedIn. So I'm going to talk about some things that have happened and then one thing in particular that is rather surprisingly not happening, and look at some of the reasons why it appears not to be happening, and talk about some things that we can do to try to ensure that it begins happening. "66 million years ago, an asteroid about the size of Mount Everest and traveling at 45,000 miles per hour slammed into the Earth off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula in Central America. And it forever changed the course of life on the planet. In a misguided attempt to localize my presentation, I've depicted the dinosaurs as lemon curd and Marmite. Not quite 11 years ago, another object, about half the size of a pack of cigarettes and traveling at the speed of Steve Jobs' keynote presentation, began to emerge from stores in North America. And while Steve Ballmer and the CEOs of Nokia, RIM, and Sony Ericsson literally laughed at it, it began slowly but inexorably, and we now know inevitably, to fundamentally change the course of life on the planet. 66 million years ago, the so-called Chicxulub impact, which I admit sounds like an ill-advised merger between KFC and Jiffy Lube, created a crater 20 kilometers deep and 180 kilometers wide. It threw debris into the atmosphere, which caused darkness, destruction, and death. In contrast, the iPhone impact, or maybe we should say the smartphone impact, or ubiquitous computing, but let's give credit where it is due to Apple. The iPhone impact creates light and enlightenment, and it has powered a dramatic and unprecedented shift from information scarcity to information superabundance. So as the consultant Micah Roos has said, as the Industrial Revolution was defined by radical efficiency in production, the digital revolution is defined by radical efficiency in information transmission. Now, it's hard to exaggerate the dimensions and the force of this transformation. People compare it to the onset of steam power, to the beginning of electrification, to the shift from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, and so on and so forth. No matter how you characterize it, no matter what proxy you use to try to understand it, the obvious point is that whenever there is a significant change in the environment, then the creatures that inhabit that environment need to change as well. And that's exactly what is happening to us as consumers over the last 10 years. So touchscreen use can actually rewire your brain. We know that millennials regularly report that they prefer their smartphones over sex. This could have disastrous consequences for the future of the species. And Microsoft scientists have proven definitively that the human attention span is now less than that of fish sticks. Fish sticks. Although I may not have been paying attention when I read the article. I think it's necessary to reconsider the very meaning of consumer. We have tended to think of consumers as potential buyers of our stuff, like this devoted mother here who's buying a selection of frozen dinners and ketchup for her family. But I think that we should think of consumers like this, not as teenage girls, but as constantly connected, constantly hungry beasts that can never get enough information. So consumer has changed from a noun to a verb, from a kind of thing to a state of being. And as consumers, we are voracious, insatiable, omnivorous, and what we consume is content. It doesn't really matter whether that content is informative and educational or entertaining and trivial and time-wasting. So, the obvious question is, if buyers have adapted quickly and relatively happily to the environmental changes caused by the iPhone impact, what about sellers? And in fact, we all, as representatives of companies and brands in one way or another, have a double task, because we not only have to adapt to information ubiquity, but we also have to adapt to the change habits and demands of those empowered consumers. So how are we doing, basically, or is the new demand for superior customer experiences going to be an extinction level event for a number of companies? There's a lot of evidence that we're doing a good job. Senior executives consistently pledge that customer experience is a top priority. This has been going on for 4 or 5 years. There's an impressive or depressing, depending on how you look at it, number of companies that are dedicated to this space, or at least there are a large amount of venture capitalists who think they're going to make money on this space. And we've been at this for a long time. So Bruce Temkin, who used to be my colleague at Forrester, has been measuring customer experience for at least well over a decade. And so if we look at the evidence, just how are we doing? And by we, I mean all of us, practitioners like most of you, agency partners, vendors, analysts as well, and so forth. So don't kill the messenger, but the fact is we suck. We really suck. There is no suckometer large enough to indicate the extent of our suckosity. So for example, in 2014, 81% of the firms in the global survey said they've seen CX initiatives fail in the last 3 years. Now, this should be good news, because I and my analyst colleagues and your vendor partners and probably your peers will tell you over and over again that if you're going to make progress with customer experience, you need to be willing to experiment. And when you experiment, you will fail. So failure is the price of progress. There's only one problem. We're not making any progress. And this is consistently demonstrated over and over again in consumer surveys, surveys of consumers. I know there are a lot of case studies out there showing that people have done this or that and met this or that business objective with customer experience initiatives. But when you ask consumers, they consistently say they are increasingly less satisfied. So Capgemini surveys thousands of people every year. Accenture Global Consumer Pulse Survey, we'll come back to that. But the clearest one is Forrester's Customer Experience Index, the CXI. And it works like this. They survey thousands and thousands of consumers across their experiences, their emotional attachments, their memories of their interactions with brands, and then they assign them a rating from excellent to very poor. The important thing here is that okay in the middle is not like, we're doing okay. It's mediocre. You do not want to be okay in the CXI. So in 2015, conveniently, Forrester reported on the CXI for the US twice, once in January and once in October. And in the more or less 6 months between those two reports, the number with a good rating declined by almost half. The number, the 2.3% of the surveyed 299 firms got better, nearly 30% got worse, and overall 1%, that's 2.99 US brands, were rated excellent. More recently, in last year's CX index for the EU, that is France, the UK, and Germany, 0 European brands rated excellent. In Germany, 83% are mediocre or worse. In the UK, twice as many declined over 2016 as improved. And in France, anybody here from France? 100% are mediocre or worse. No one even gets a good rating, let alone excellent. And over half are poor or very, very poor. So the point is that this kind of evidence shows that customer experience management has failed. We just haven't figured out how to do it yet. Faced with the greatest change in the business environment since the onset of the Industrial Revolution, nearly every company has been unable to adapt to that changed environment. So the question is, why? So, why is it so damned hard to improve customer experience? And my suggestion is 2 main reasons: because we do too little and because we do too much, or we try to do too much. And I'm going to try to explain that with the assistance of these 3 characters. First of all, anybody recognize this guy? Microsoft? Steven Sinofsky. Steven Sinofsky is a product development and product management guru, prolific author, currently an advisor of some kind at Andreessen Horowitz in the VC firm in California. And Sinofsky most famously said, don't ship the org chart. Okay? Don't make the mistake of allowing your internal structures and divisions and departmental battles to be expressed in the products and services that you offer, whether that's a product or a service or your customer experiences that you're putting out there for people. In short, don't air your dirty laundry. Now, this is kind of funny because he worked for a number of years as the vice president of the Windows division at Microsoft, and it's probably fair to say that in the latter Balmer years, Microsoft failed in a lot of areas, especially mobile, because they insisted upon promoting the Windows division over the other aspects of the Microsoft empire. So basically, Microsoft failed because they didn't follow Sinofsky's dictum. But you can see what he's getting at. Customers don't care about your lines of business, about your P&Ls, about your workflows, about your silos, about your turf battles, or your resource constraints. When you ship a product, a service, or an experience, it should avoid reflecting any of those organizational concerns. Now, that's far from easy to do, evidently. It's remarkable that we've been talking about this outside-in thinking. My colleagues at Forrester wrote a book about it 7 years ago. And yet so many companies are clearly tripping over and broadcasting their internal divisions and internal arrangements. And maybe there's an essential reason for that. Because when Sinofsky says, don't ship the org chart, he actually doesn't mean don't ship the org chart. In fact, he means almost precisely the opposite. It's not a warning about something that you ought to try to avoid. It is a statement of fact about something you cannot avoid, something that is unavoidable. He means you will ship the org chart. And I'm not just making this up and imposing it on Sinofsky. He's confirmed this himself, and he regularly speaks on this topic, precisely this point. That when I said don't ship the org chart, I actually meant you will ship the org chart. It's like it's inevitable, it's inescapable, it's preordained, it's like a natural law, and in fact, Sinofsky is consciously reformulating something called Conway's Law. Melvin Conway was a developer and a manager of developers in the beyond the 1960s. But in 1968, he published an article in Datamation magazine in which he formulated this law, which is like Moore's law, not a law, but an observation. Organizations which design systems in the broad sense used here are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. A little more simply, the system being produced will tend to have a structure that mirrors the structure of the group that is producing it. Okay? Or organization design is system design. So, Conway's Law has been tested and proven in studies of software development teams. And I think it's also very clearly evident by negative example in the cases of customer experience, in our customer experience efforts. And that's what I mean by doing too little for customer experience management. Companies tend to deploy numerous and varied software solutions to produce and support multiple, disconnected, fragmented experiences that largely reflect the organizational silos and departments of the company. So separate teams responsible for the website and email marketing and brand marketing and app development and customer support and the physical store and etc. Always-on access and information abundance have allowed consumers to evolve into something like Lucy, the title character of Luc Bresson's brilliant movie. Has anybody besides me seen this? I made up for it, thank you. I made up for it by seeing it 7 or 8 times. Lucy is, so to speak, a woman who develops superhuman abilities, and that is, she, by accident, becomes able to use 100% of her brain power rather than the supposed 10% that most of us have access to. So we produce consumers that are like Lucy, and yet we treat consumers like Lucy, the small-brained proto-human that ape-like creature that we can distract and manipulate with personalized offers and discount coupons that are delivered to the right person at the right time on the right device and the right channel and so forth. So here's the tweetable version. We practice customer experience management with too little attention to the customer's experience. It is the customer's experience after all. It is not the experience we want the consumer to have. It ought to be the experience that they have and they aim to have and they want to have, and we need to figure that out. So apostrophes matter. And also, we practice customer experience with too little attention to the fact that this customer has one experience. All of those little things that we try to do eventually add up to the customer's experience, the one impression of the product and the brand. So singular nouns matter as well. So what Conway's law dictates is that it cannot possibly be the case that digital marketing is equal to customer experience, or that customer experience can be exclusively or even largely a marketing responsibility. What they tell us is that the integrated, holistic, intelligent experiences favored by consumers can be delivered only by an integrated, holistic, intelligent organization with the representation from all the facets and functions that engage consumers. But the hashtag here has to be, this is utterly useless advice. Okay? Why? I think there are two reasons. The first reason is that all of our efforts to affect organizational change, and in a certain way this is what we're trying to do all of the time, right, as CEO and executive teams, are more often than not just as uncoordinated and disintegrated and non-holistic as are our isolated and fragmented attempts to improve customer experience. So we call for breaking down silos or adopting a collaboration platform or assuming an outside-in perspective, but we rarely know exactly what the business justification or the roadmap or the KPIs are going to be for that effort. Exactly why are we doing this? And how are we going to know, how are we going to measure and know if we're doing it correctly? But the second reason why we might struggle so much with organizational change is that potentially it is impossible, or virtually impossible. So Clayton Christensen, I'm sure you all know, published an article in Harvard Business Review in 2000 called presciently, Meeting the Challenge of Disruptive Change. And he says, when the capabilities of an organization have become embedded in its culture, change can be extraordinarily difficult. So what he's talking about here are these three capabilities, which in the article he mostly calls resources, processes, and values. But they're sometimes also called RPP, resources, processes, and priorities, or the three Ps, people, processes, and priorities, or purposes. But the key thing, as Christensen already indicated in that last quote, is that this last thing is what we call culture, company culture. Right? Culture each, when we say culture each strategy for breakfast, we're referring to that culture. So at the risk of oversimplifying this 12-page article, which I encourage you all to read, I think it's useful to look at the relationship between these capabilities and their development within an organization like this. So when a company starts out, when it's in a startup mode, it consists of nothing but resources. Right? It has people, skills, maybe materials, funding, and so forth. And the job of every startup, every single startup has exactly the same job. There is only one job for every startup in the world, and that is to find some product market fit. And so you create an MVP, a minimum viable product, and that is like throwing clay on a pottery wheel. And you produce something. And let's say you make a bowl. And you take that to the market and you test it. And the market says, kind of interesting, but it's too big. Okay? Now, as a startup, all you have to do is just push that clay back together and go back to the wheel. And you instead throw a cup. And you test that, and they say, better but not quite. And then you produce, so you push it back together again, you throw it again, and you produce a vase or a vase. Okay? And the market says, perfect. This is exactly what we've always wanted, even if we didn't know it. You've got product market fit. So now the job of the company changes. It changes into ensuring that you can consistently and reliably produce that thing that the market wants. So you begin developing processes, and that's like firing this vase in a kiln to make it hard. And eventually those processes become things that you do automatically. It's just the way we do things around here. You do them without thinking. At that point, your processes have become culture. And this is a necessary and valuable and completely justified process until the market changes in some way or another, until the demands or the expectations or the competitive landscape of the market changes, and your vase is no longer the best possible fit for that environment. And now you've got basically two choices. You can either limp along with a product that is potentially increasingly out of step with market expectations, or you can try to change the product. But if you apply too much pressure to that vase, which has now been fired, that is, you've developed processes that have turned into culture, you risk literally breaking the organization. So does that mean that organizational change is actually impossible? Not quite. Oh, sorry, let me give you the conclusion of this. Organizations are hard to change because they are organized. And they become organized in the process of developing processes and culture. And that means that they will be hard to change. It's the same thing. They're hard to change because they are hardened. And this hardening is the key for their success, and it is at the same time the limitation on their ability to adapt to a change environment. That is quite simply the innovator's dilemma for Christensen. So does that mean that it is impossible for an organization to change in order to produce finally desirable customer experiences? And the answer is not quite, because Christensen allows there are three ways, only three ways, to change an organization. And in terms of our analogy, the first one is buy a different pot. If the vase is no longer adequate to the market, buy the thing that is, okay? Buy the serving platter, okay? The water pitcher, whatever it is. Acquire a different organization whose processes and values or culture closely match the requirements of the new task, the new environment. Or you can throw a new pot, create a new pot. So spin out an independent organization from the existing organization and develop within it the new processes and values required to solve the new problem. And finally, the only other option is create a new pot from pieces of the old one. Okay? Kind of strange. Create new organizational structures within corporate boundaries in which new processes can be developed. Now, there's something odd about these three things. That is, the first one, you're not actually changing your organization, you're just acquiring another organization and putting it together with that one. And the second one, similarly, you're not really changing the old organization, you're just building up another one. So if you want to actually change the organization, take your existing organization and change it, then according to Christensen, although he doesn't say this himself as far as I know, the third option is the only way to do it. That's the only way to organically change an organization from the inside. Okay? So what would this mean? How would what is this actually, how do we play this out in a real world environment? How would that work? How do you go about building a new organization from fragments or pieces of the old one? And is it a way to avoid customer experience management extinction? So, almost at the end of this article, Christensen says, understanding a problem is the most critical step in solving it. And this seems banal, right? This is the kind of thing we learn when doing math story problems in third grade. We need to figure out what the problem here is before we start running equations to solve the problem. But I think Christensen's being quite exact here. I think he's being very careful. So one, understanding the problem is essential to solving it. right? We can't do away with it. As business people, we tend to want to be pragmatic and to rush into action, but you must spend the time understanding the problem. It was Einstein didn't actually say this, but people say he did, that if I have an hour to solve a problem, I'll spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes solving it, that kind of thing. But secondly, understanding is crucial in the sense of critical, in the sense of a medical condition that is critical. The patient is in a critical condition, meaning it could go either way. And that raises the kind of frightening specter that you might think you're understanding the problem, and then you devote your resources, you deploy your resources to solve the problem, but you're actually working on the wrong problem. So you wasted all this effort trying to solve, and maybe even solving, a problem that wasn't the real problem. Okay? So how would that work out in terms of customer experience? Well, we know what customer experience is. This is indisputable. Everybody agrees that if you want to describe customer experience, it's something like this definition: a customer's perception of a company or brand based on all of their interactions during the entire customer lifecycle. So if that's what customer experience is, then customer experience management ought to be the management of a customer's perception of a company or brand based upon all their interactions during the entire customer lifecycle, right? And then we get, to illustrate this conviction, things like this: end-to-end customer lifecycle. Or more honestly, I think this is from Oracle, an infinite loop. It goes on and on and on, right? So if you adapt this approach to customer experience management, your task is very clearly defined. What you need to do is manage potentially thousands of individual interactions over decades, perhaps, for every one of your customers and every one of your prospects across all of your segments and locales and languages at every stage of the entire customer lifecycle, and do all of that in a way that is not only multi-channel, but what the consumer wants, transparently omni-channel. And then you have to remember that all of this culminates in an individual's perception, that is, in a mental state inside someone's head. Now that's what you're trying to manage if you take this totalizing view to customer experience management. And I think it's clear that if that commonly, I assert, commonly accepted definition of CXM is how you go about trying to operationalize and execute on CXM, then CXM is simply impossible. I used to call this the total impossibility of customer experience management, meaning this totalizing approach to customer experience, trying to manage every aspect of the end-to-end customer lifecycle. It is, so to speak, mathematically impossible. It is practically impossible. You could not possibly deploy enough resources to do it. And if you could, it would probably be a waste of time. So, fortunately, there is a better way. As customers, as consumers, we don't experience life cycles. When you go out to get something done, do you think, oh, I wonder where, first I have to determine where I am in the life cycle, right? And then I'll know what to do today when I get out of the car. Instead, what we ought to be doing as practitioners is looking at discrete, self-contained customer journeys, because journeys are how we all actually get stuff done. So in this McKinsey illustration, it just shows how some simple journeys like onboarding journey, problem resolution journey, cut across those organizational silos that are keeping us from producing holistic customer experiences. So instead of the massive customer life cycle, I think we should look at something like this, where there are high points, high value journeys that are like the crests of a wave. And they are high value in both senses. That is, they offer the greatest opportunity for you to potentially make more revenue, and they offer the greatest opportunity for you to ensure that the customer has a positive experience, which ultimately ought to feed back into your revenue goals. But if journeys are like wave crests, then they are necessarily divided by troughs. And in these troughs, customers probably don't care about you that much at all. which means that if you do, again, try to manage every aspect of the customer experience, if you think, oh my God, we haven't sent this person an email in 10 days, right? That there's a good possibility that you're going to irritate them, that you're actually corrupting the overall customer experience by constantly wanting to be in touch with them. Then when they don't want to have anything to do with you at that point. And this structure of high and low points is effectively reproduced within a single high-value customer journey. So there are 3 customer journeys here. I've been doing this for a year, and I still can't figure out how to make this graphic more attractive. And within each one of the high-value customer journeys, there are a number of so-called hotspots, which again have an undue influence on the outcome of that particular high-value journey. So you want to identify those and focus on those. And those hotspots might be hot because, again, they're an opportunity to make a great impression, or they might be hot because you know that that's an area where consumers are regularly pissed off, and you want to avoid doing that. So they can be negative or positive. So in any given business segment, there are often a surprisingly small number of high-value journeys. Now, I'm sure there's some people from banks here who will dispute this, but I think, if you think of retail banking, this is not a bad account of high-value customer banking journeys, or accommodations, hotels and other accommodations. That's not to say that these are all of the journeys that a customer is going to have with a hotel chain, but you can imagine that there are a kind of a hierarchy. There are like tier 1, super high-value customer journeys, and then there's tier 2, and then there's tier 3. Okay, the cable onboarding journey. Now, it's important to note that this journey, the onboarding journey, begins only after a previous journey, like the research and comparison shopping journey, has been completed. All right? That's what I mean by these journeys are relatively discrete. And it will be followed, the onboarding journey will be followed, hopefully, by a period of just satisfied usage. Where again, as customers, we don't care. I don't care about my cable company, right? I care about my cable company only when either I run into an issue resolution journey or more happily into a service upgrade journey, right? But that might be years in the future, okay? But what I want to emphasize here is, so these are the not exhaustive, but I think all of the high points in this onboarding journey with the departments or roles and responsibilities, or roles that are responsible for each one of those steps. So you can see the website, the email center, the call center, field technicians in their trucks and so forth, and right down to financing for the final billing, which ends the onboarding journey. So here there are 6 or 7 business units that play a role in the success of the onboarding journey. And they might all be doing a great job. Right? They're all measuring themselves very carefully. They're all performing at, say, 95% satisfaction. Every one of them. That's great, except 95% satisfaction across 6 touch points means that 25% of all consumers who are involved in this journey are dissatisfied. Okay? And there's no way to know that if you're only looking at the individual siloed touch points. So the suggestion here is create cross-functional journey teams. I think I made this up, maybe other people use it. And in other words, take those people on the website team, on the field support team, in the email center, in billing and so forth, that are contributing to the success of the onboarding journey, and make them singularly responsible for the onboarding journey. Don't think of yourself as a member of the website team or the email marketing team anymore. Think of yourself as this team that is there to improve and optimize and make the onboarding journey as good as it possibly can be. And what you're doing when that happens is you are breaking off pieces of the existing organization and putting them together in a new form. You're doing exactly what Christensen said is the third way. Putting them together in a new form in which new processes and values can be developed. So I'm not saying that this is what Christensen had in mind, that customer journey management and journey teams is what he had in mind, but I think it does correspond quite directly to what he describes as the third way to do organizational change, and again, the only way to actually change an organization from the inside. So the benefits of CRM are many. I've mentioned a lot of them, that high-value customer journeys are usually relatively few. It informs the ways in which you want to go about getting data and being able to describe the benefits that you're going to deliver in exchange and so forth. But look at this last point. Guided by the brand story and promise, linked journeys improve the customer's experience. The key thing here is the linked journeys, because obviously, if you identify and optimize numerous customer journeys, like the onboarding journey, the issue resolution journey, the service upgrade journey, but if you do only that, you risk reproducing the fragmented and siloed approach that you're often caught in today. So you have to figure out how to link these journeys together to reflect the customer's singular customer's experience, right? And that's the work of what I have tended to call orchestration, right? Orchestrate the customer's journey and the movement across these individual journeys, or the customer's experience across these individual journeys. I like the notion, the metaphor of orchestration, because of what it illustrates in terms of how the individual players in an orchestra combine to produce uniquely a symphony that none of them could do independently, obviously. But there is always a danger of introducing new terminology, especially somewhat poetic terminology, into a business environment, because people could have just simply wildly different views of what is meant by orchestration. So I actually have become kind of fond of the notion of taking our established terminology and practice and technologies of governance and expanding that from content governance, digital governance, to governance of the overall customer experience management. Because what you're doing there is everything that you guys all know about governance even better than I do as Crown Peak customers. Determining the roles, the decision-making pathways, who's going to be responsible for what at every step of the way. And so governance of customer experience management seems to be desperately necessary. And customer journey management is like the Goldilocks insight. Sorry. Touchpoint marketing-centric CXM is too small to have an impact on consumers. Totalized lifecycle management is too large, and it's pointless and impossible. Customer journey management is just right, and maybe it is the only way to avoid extinction in this new environment of empowered consumers and ubiquitous information. And so with that, I think, oh wait, there's one more thing. And that is that if a well-researched and organized and systematically governed customer journey management effort represents the best possible structure and approach to finally making progress with customer experience, that effort still requires fuel. And the fuel is, of course, customer data. And the problem here is that Accenture, as I said, we'd come back to it, in their reporting on last year's global consumer pulse survey, 30,000 plus consumers in dozens of countries, at least 22 countries, I think. Accenture confirms what some have long suspected, and what they call that there exists a vicious circle. The vicious circle goes like this. Yes, we as consumers do expect and demand personalized, or what they call hyper-relevant experiences. We appreciate them. Right? I really like the idea of talking about relevance. I think Adrian was doing this too in his presentation, rather than personalization, because when you get right down to it, very few of us want to have a personal relationship with a company or product, or even a company brand or even a product, but we do want relevance. Relevance means, the definition of relevance means pertinent to the matter at hand. And of course, it's related etymologically to relief, relieve, right? Relieving my burden, lightening my load. That's what we're all looking for. We want experiences that help us get shit done more easily. That's relevance. Okay? So consumers, yes, they do want highly personalized, relevant experiences, and they will punish brands that do not provide them. That is, they will abandon or consider abandoning brands that do not provide them. And Accenture likes to calculate what they call the switching economy. That is all of the money that's put into play when consumers do switch or consider switching a provider based upon unsatisfactory customer experiences. And they calculate that this amounted to going on $6 trillion worldwide in 2017. Okay? But, as we've all experienced in the last week, consumers are also increasingly alerted to and anxious about the data risk of sharing personal data, which makes them increasingly reluctant to provide the personal data that is necessary to create those hyper-relevant experiences. This is the vicious circle. You must have access to personal data, and it's increasingly hard to get it. Either because, well, no, let's not say either yet, okay? So the solution is put customers in control of their data. That is, relieve their anxiety, relieve their fear about sharing data by assuring them that they are in control of how their data is used and shared or not shared. And they can have it back at any time. And they have some sense, some very good sense of what you're doing with it. And they have control over what you do with it. So what we need in order to break out of this vicious circle is some kind of template or some kind of roadmap that shows us how we would go about putting customers in control of their data. And that's exactly what the GDPR aims to do. Okay? Recital 7, this is page 4, I think, of the 261-page PDF in English. Natural persons should have control of their own personal data. This is what I call the Urprinzip, the core goal of the GDPR. That's 10 words, which can easily be reduced to 8 words because natural persons are people, and their own personal data is redundant. So people should have control of their personal data. Okay. So you thought that the GDPR was the bane of your existence, and it's actually your very best friend. It is the only way, or something very, very much like the GDPR, is, on this argument, the only way to finally make progress with customer experience management. And it's not, well, maybe we don't want to make progress. No, if you don't make progress, you're going to expire. Right? You have to become competitive in this new environment. And so far, we're not able to. Okay? Now, before I say anything more about the GDPR, the legal disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. Unlike Gregory Peck, I do not play one in the movies. So I am not trying to offer legal advice or guidance, but just help you touch on some of the high points. Now, this will be a little bit repetitious for people who were in Adrian's session earlier today, but I hope it's not too much. So the question is, if you take this proposition seriously, if you embrace the notion that people should have control of their personal data, and you want to make it happen, setting aside the GDPR entirely, what kinds of things would follow from that? What would you do, and what would you not do to reflect the fact that you want people to have control of their data? Okay? If we had a little more time, I'd ask for suggestions, but let's race forward. I think it's clear, I think it's indisputable that you would do things like acknowledge that the data belongs to the person it identifies and you're only borrowing it. Ask them before you take it. Tell them what you're going to do with it. Do only what you said you were going to do with it, right? Or go back and ask them again. Give it back, that is, delete it, as soon as you're done with it, or as soon as they demand it back, right? And don't do things like use it for other purposes without their permission, or treat it as your own, or for God's sake, sell it to some third party without telling them, right? Now, I think those follow naturally from the proposition that people should have control of their data. And those are more or less precisely the core processing principles of the GDPR. Okay? Purpose limitation. You must specify the purpose and use it for only that purpose. Storage limitation. You must store it, you must delete it as soon as the processing purpose is completed. Right? Integrity and confidentiality. You must protect it while you have it. Data minimization. This is the one that flies most in the face of our current practices. You must use the least possible amount of data to achieve the purpose. Right? And that includes sharing it with or literally showing it to as few people as possible, exposing it to as few eyeballs as possible. And these core processing principles are accompanied by the data subject rights. Okay? So consumers have the right to know if you are processing their data, to receive an inventory of it, to have it corrected or rectified, to have it erased, certain circumstances, the right to be forgotten, and to have the data controller bundle up their data and send it to another party, to a competitor. That's so-called data portability. Okay? And I can reiterate and justify this notion that consumer control is the underlying goal of the GDPR with this kind of odd statement from the Information Commissioner's Office here in the UK. Those organizations which thrive, not just survive, thrive under the GDPR will be those that recognize the key feature is to put the individual at the heart of data protection law. Think first about how people want their data handled, and then use those principles to underpin how you go about preparing, and it means you won't go far wrong. This is the kind of thing that people who are looking for legal certainty, right? Just tell me what to do, okay? I just want to know what to do and then I'll do it, okay? And they get very frustrated when looking at the GDPR because it's not that kind of regulation, right? This is kind of like if you were asking the regulator, just tell me how many tons of particulates I can emit from my smokestacks in my factory. And the regulator says, just think of the children playing downwind from the factory and you won't go far wrong. Okay? It's not that far off. This is what we call it's what we call a principles-based regulation. You have to follow the principle of the GDPR. What's important is the principle, not the letter. That's why you can't, you will never find a loophole in the GDPR. There are no loopholes in the GDPR, not because it is so carefully written as to eradicate every possible loophole, but because even if you find a loophole, you still have to follow the principle of data protection, regardless of what it says in the text. So in effect, forget you saw that. The GDPR makes customer centricity, right? That thing that we've all sworn that we're all dedicated to for the last 4 or 5 years, but have actually not really put into practice very effectively. It makes customer centricity a legal requirement. You will be customer centric in this sense, right? So here's the GDPR in only 6 words. This might have been what Adrian had in mind with the rewriting of the 10 Commandments as well. So obviously it's not it's no longer necessary to do GDPR 101, and we certainly don't have the time. But let me close by reviewing 3 very popular and very, very widespread misconceptions about the GDPR, and then look at what I think it means for marketing. So in the article, I didn't call them misconceptions, I just decided to call them lies. And this is a recent article on LinkedIn and on Content Advisory, I think. So the first one is GDPR concerns the personal data of EU citizens. This is particularly a source of anxiety in the US, where people are worried that a tourist from London or Paris is going to walk into their store and they're going to have to treat them with GDPR compliant behavior, right? Doesn't have anything to do with it. The word citizen does not appear in the regulation. The word resident also doesn't appear in the regulation, although EU residence is a lot closer to the truth. So if Christopher Walsh, the Austrian actor, is in LA surfing the web, he has no more protection from the GDPR than the American citizens who are sitting around him. If Quentin Tarantino travels to Vienna to visit Christopher Walsh, he's covered by the GDPR while he's in Vienna. Okay? So the flow chart, if you can read it, I don't think I can. Is the company located in the EU? Yes or no? If yes, then GDPR applies. GDPR applies for all of its data processing. And the surprising thing that I just realized literally yesterday on the basis of this is 89% of Facebook's users, okay, 1.9 billion people, are served out of Facebook Ireland. 1.9 billion Facebook users will have full GDPR protection as of May 25th. Okay, the company isn't located in the EU. Next question. Does it offer goods or services to people in the EU? Whether you charge for them or they're free, doesn't matter. Okay? If yes, GDPR applies. If no, do you monitor the behavior of people in the EU? So all those cookies that are dropped onto your browser when you go to anywhere for the purposes of the digital advertising ecosystem, they are monitoring your behavior. They have to comply with the GDPR. And finally, if no, then does the company process the data of anyone in the EU? That's not citizens, not strictly speaking residents, but anybody in the EU, physically located in the EU, on behalf of a controller in the EU. If yes, then GDPR applies. And only if the answer is no to all of those things does the GDPR not apply. Adrian talked about this. Processing personal data requires explicit consent. I can't count how many times I've seen this. Most of them say explicit consent, or they just say processing will require consent. Both of those are wrong. One, because consent is one of 6 legal grounds. And secondly, when you do use consent, most of the time the requirement is unambiguous consent, not explicit. I can explain the difference between those two later if you want. It's very subtle. For marketers and customer experience professionals, I think consent and legitimate interest will be the two that you'll most often appeal to. And then finally, number 3, legitimate interest will shield data-driven marketing practices. I've seen this over and over again as well. There will be, they literally say the GDPR will have very little impact on our current marketing practices because of the direct marketing clause in the GDPR. There's no direct marketing clause in the GDPR. What it does say is in recital 47, the processing of personal data for direct marketing purposes may be regarded as carried out for legitimate interest. May be, not is to be, shall be, but may be. And yes, the Article 29 Working Party has said that companies could very well have a legitimate interest in getting to know their customers' preferences in order to better personalize their offers. Well, that sounds great. That's exactly what we want to do. But look at the very next paragraph. This is a perfect description of most of our current data-driven marketing practices. However, this does not mean that controllers would be able to rely on legitimate interest to monitor the online, offline behavior of their customers, combine vast amounts of data about them from various sources that were initially collected for other contexts, and create complex profiles of their customers' personalities and preferences without their knowledge, let alone informed consent. So precisely what we are doing, precisely the approach to digital marketing, that is, getting as much data as possible, combining it for the purposes of building profiles and personalization has already been explicitly excluded from legitimate interest by the EU regulators. This is your data environment post-GDPR. We moved from superabundance of data in which it was digital exhaust that you could just vacuum up whenever you wanted without the knowledge or consent of the individual to an era of scarcity, where it is like borrowing the car that produces that exhaust. We move from an era where you were rewarded for being a data predator. As Tim Riley said, the guy with the most data wins, to an era in which you are required to be a data shepherd. Elizabeth Denham, the ICO commissioner, says she wants people to manage personal data sensitively and ethically. And we move from big data to beg data. And let's look at what that means for marketing. I think it's really important to emphasize the strangeness of this new environment that we're moving into. And the nice thing is that the GDPR describes that new environment. We know what is coming, or we can know what is coming. But whether or not you agree with me on the positive impact of the GDPR for customer experience, I think it's absolutely necessary that you do not look at the GDPR as some kind of burdensome added layer of red tape that you need to try to struggle against and protect as much as possible of your current business practices going forward. It is rather the description of a whole new ball game, as we say, okay? It is a different kind of activity, a different kind of sport that you've never played before, and the new season opens on 25 May 2018. Okay? Now, if you want to, you need to understand and observe the rules of this new game. You need to know, how many players can take part and what moves are allowed and the limits of the playing field and so on and so forth. You need to understand the regulation, in other words. And if you do all of that, you might avoid penalties. You might avoid fines. You might survive under the GDPR, but you will still lose in the competitive landscape. Because what you need to do if you're going to win, if you're going to survive and thrive under the GDPR, you need to devise and practice and perfect and burn into your muscle memory the kinds of tactics and strategies and moves that are going to allow you to dominate, to be a dominant player on this new playing field. So what are some of the moves that you want to master? Consent requests. Adrian did a great job of looking at this today. The consent request, the initial consent request, okay, is going to be perhaps the most important interaction that you can have with any prospect and potential customer. Right? Because are you going to present that consent request in a way that gets a positive response? And that means that you're not going to want to use some generic template when you present that request. You're not going to want to say, you're not going to want to formulate it exactly in the same way for everybody. Right? You're not going to want to design it in exactly the same way for everybody, because we have things like different kinds of temperaments about my attitude towards data usage and so forth, my age perhaps, what channel I'm on, so on and so forth. In short, I think these consent requests have to be primarily the responsibility of customer experience professionals who know how to get the best possible positive response out of customers. That's what they're there for. Right? Obviously, they need to have the input of legal and IT and so on and so forth, but it has to be led by customer experience professionals. Very popular question, is there a so-called grandfather clause that allows you to continue using data that you collected prior to May 2018? The answer is yes, if, only if, it was collected in a way that is compliant with the GDPR. And in my view, very, very little of your existing data is going to meet that standard because the GDPR is such a higher standard than has existed, or maybe in some cases has existed before, or certainly as has been practiced before, practiced and enforced before. So it would be strange if you were already collecting data in a GDPR compliant manner. So that means the answer is effectively no. You will probably find that you can't use very much of your existing data without going back and getting what's called reconsent or repermissioning in a GDPR compliant manner. So what's implicit in these last 2 points is that how you ask for consent will depend upon whom you are asking, right? And again, the important thing is whether it's consent or legitimate interest, okay? Doesn't really matter. That's why I call it marketing for permissions, because if you're asking for consent, obviously, you're asking, may I, okay? If you use legitimate interest, even if you discover you have a legitimate interest and can prove it, you need to inform the data subject and give them a very, very clear opt-out option. So they still effectively need to give their permission passively. Active permission or passive permission, you're still marketing for permissions. And I think that many of your existing skills and tools and business processes around things like persona building and user research and targeting and personalization can be and should be redeployed for this effort. How do we appeal to that particular person in a way that's most likely to get a positive response? And finally, I think, remember this new right to data portability. So under certain pretty broad conditions, consumers can direct you to extract all of their personal data and send it to someone else, probably a competitor. And this creates a whole new vector of business competition and innovation. So what can you do? What kinds of appeals, what kinds of benefits, what kind of value can you offer to your competitors' current customers so that they switch, not just switch their business, right? Not just switch their business from the competitor to you, but perhaps even more valuably, switch their data from the competitor to you. And by the same token, at the same time, how do you defend against your competitors' efforts to do the same thing to your existing customers? So, right before the line I quoted from recital 7, it says, given the importance of creating trust that will allow the digital economy to develop across the internal market. In the GDPR era, customer experience and customer engagement all comes down to trust, which is to say it begins with trust because you somehow want to encourage that trust at the beginning, because without the trust it will be difficult to get consent, and without consent it'll be virtually impossible to access data, and without data it will be virtually impossible to create and sustain and improve your customer experiences. In effect, you will fall further and further and further behind. Those that are smart enough or lucky enough to get access to data early in the customer relationship are going to be able to build on that, or should be able to build on that, to create a better experience and to deliver on the benefits that they said that the customer was going to get. And then they're more likely to get even more data, and then they're more likely to get even more. And those who are unlucky enough or unattentive enough not to get data at the beginning are going to fall farther and farther behind. In a commercial relationship, trust is the attitude that the consumers have, and trustworthiness is the property that companies and brands acquire. And you nurture trust by being trustworthy, right? And you demonstrate trustworthiness by delivering on your promises consistently. And in the customer experience, trust is usually at the end or near the end, after the purchase. Even when I buy something, when I literally decide that I'm going to buy from you and give you my money, I'm still really anxious that whether I'm making the right decision. It's only after I've used it that I might develop trust. And so the big challenge now is, how do we, as it were, move trust upstream in the customer relationship? How can we instill trust much closer to the beginning of our engagement with that prospect/customer? Right? That's the big challenge. I think it's clear that it will involve carefully analyzed customer journeys that are going to allow you to know, or get you closer to knowing, exactly what that person is trying to achieve at precisely this point, and therefore make it more likely that you can describe the value that you are going to be able to deliver, and so forth. And at the same time, meticulously governed customer journey management so that you can be confident of delivering the things that you promise. And now I finally have reached the end. Thanks.